So I'll just briefly introduce our guest, Lord Bhiku Parekh. So Lord Parekh taught at the London School of Economics and the University of Glasgow before shifting to the University of Hull. Between 1981 and 84, he was the Vice-Chancellor at the Maharaja Sayajirao University of Baroda in India. He was also a holder of Centennial Professorship in the Centre for the Study of Global Governance at the London School of Economics and a professorship of political philosophy at the University of Westminster. In 2002, he served as the president of the Academy of Learned Societies in the Social Sciences. Lord Bhiku Parekh has also served on the Commission for Racial Equality, including his spell as vice chairman. He has also held membership in several bodies concerned with racial equality and multiculturalism. He was most notably the chairman of the Commission on the Future of Multi-Ethnic Britain from 1998 to 2000. This report of the body, often referred to as the Parekh Report, has been the basis for much of the debate on multiculturalism in the UK in the early 21st century. Lord Parekh then became a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts in 1988 and the Academy of Learned Societies in the Social Sciences in 1999. In 2000, he was appointed to the House of Lords with a life peerage as Baron Parekh of Kingston upon Hull in the East Riding of Yorkshire. He was also conferred with Padma Bhushan by the Government of India in 2007. With that, Pushkar, you can proceed on.
Thank you so much, Anshu. I'm grateful to Lord Parekh for accepting our invitation to speak to our forum. The topic that I had suggested to Lord Parekh was political philosophy in the age of multiculturalism. There's a reason for phrasing the topic in that way. I didn't want the topic or the conversation to be restricted just to political philosophy or to his work on multiculturalism or to the political philosophy of multiculturalism, but instead to explore the intersections as well as the union between the two subjects. And before we start with our conversation with questions, with the question that we have in mind, I'd request Lord Parekh to deliver an autobiographical statement that we had suggested to him, reflecting on his writings and some of his sources of influence and motivations over his career, after which we'll delve into the questions that we have in mind. Thank you so much, Lord Parekh, for accepting our invitation. We'll hand over the floor to you now.
No, I'm listening to you. No immediate reaction. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, we can hear you. You may proceed with your remarks.
Well, you give my biographical sketch, which is fine, except that if it was possible, I would add a sentence, which is that in addition to these public honors, which come and go, for academics, they don't really matter. What matters is an academic honor. And of all the various honors, the one I prize the most is Fellowship of the British Academy. I became FBO about 10 years ago, and I cherish it. That's all. Otherwise, what you say is perfectly agreeable.
As a preliminary question, because our topic says political philosophy in the age of multiculturalism, I wanted to ask you about your take on the role of political philosophy as we think of governance and governments. I was reading a piece by Harvey Mansfield in which he made a distinction between political philosophy and political science. Now, in India and in Indian universities, I think you may be aware that the entire course is generally referred to as a political science degree. So it's a bachelor's with honors in, say, political science, or a bachelor's in political science, whereas political philosophy is merely a paper or a course which is studied as part of this degree. Now, Professor Mansfield introduced a distinction that I found interesting between political philosophy being aspirational and normative, whereas political science referring to, say, more descriptive analysis of what a state should look like and what governance should look like. I was interested in listening to, as our first question, listening to your take as you have worked on political philosophy extensively throughout your career, on what political philosophy is, what its meaning is, and what it should entail as we think about politics and society.
Well, you raised some extremely important question. Let me start with the first bit, which is political philosophy versus political science. I think the distinction between the two is profound. Political science is empirical, is concerned with data on this or that aspect of political behavior, is not concerned by itself to recommend. So, if you like, one tends to take a largely positivist view of science, whereas one also tends to take a normative view of philosophy. So, the first point I would wish to make is there are four different ways in which one can approach the discipline: political science, which is empirical generalization; political philosophy, which is reflecting on the place of politics in human life and political concepts; political thought, which is simply distillation of ideas which various people have left behind; and political theory, which is in the same direction of philosophy but falling quite short of it. Falling quite short of it. And certainly in Britain, you would see I have occupied a chair of political philosophy. My colleague, who teaches the same thing, is called Professor of Political Theory. And the student would ask, what is the difference between the two? And I don't see any. So it's also a matter of convention. You get used to a particular language and you use it. But by and large, I would say that philosophy is digging deeper, is less concerned with empirical generalization. Whereas theory on both these counts takes a different view. It does not dig deeper into the fundamentals of an event or activity, and it's entirely empirical to the extent that it is possible. Because one could say an entirely empirical, scientific, positivist view of science is inherently untenable. Kuhn, for example, Structure of Scientific Revolution, has shown that no inquiry can be entirely descriptive or entirely positivist. Every inquiry has to have a normative thrust. Granted all that, and I would say, subject to those qualifications, there are important differences between science and philosophy. I'm sorry I gave you a long answer to a short question.
Thank you, Lord Parekh, for that. Since we started on a road on education as well, especially training of political science or political philosophy. And I'm currently a bachelor's undergraduate student of politics as such. I was really interested in your paper on the poverty of Indian political thought, wherein you sort of traced out how sort of underdevelopment of political theory in India was also largely reflective of the sort of training that we had in this country. Now, that paper is kind of, I believe, 30 decades has passed since then. I think it was published in 1992. And I really wanted to ask you how you think, or if you have any understanding of how education or training in political theory or political philosophy has progressed in India in the current times. Because when I look around my peer circles at large as well, I find it largely reflective of people who wanted to get into the bureaucratic or civil services, and that's why opting into political science as a discipline instead of to sort of quip, as you remarked, the difference between understanding political theory or political philosophy. So that's my question to you. What do you think about it right now?
Yes, well, that's a tricky question, and a question which I'm sure, in some sense, upset some of our countrymen when the article first appeared. But I think by and large, we have come to accept that what I was saying has a kernel of truth in it. I asked people to point out to me who would you call an eminent political philosopher in India, or even a political theorist in India, and the answer was none. You could point to a political scientist, people who do empirical work, data crunching, and all of that, Rajni Kothari, many others. But you couldn't think of a serious political philosopher. Or if you do, it will be somebody who is looking back to the past, working on the ancient Indian political thought, yagna, and those sorts of concepts in terms of which we understood politics, but doesn't really add up to very much. So my own view is that as of 1990 or whatever, when the article first appeared, the description was correct. Have things changed since then? I think they have. Not completely. You can't overhaul a discipline in 2 years' time. But there are certain writings beginning to appear. I saw the Kaviraj, for example, and I refer to him as well as somebody who is producing good work. Partha Chatterjee, although more in the direction of political sociology and political science, still there are bits there which are concerned with political philosophy. Thomas Bentham, in his own way, the poor chap is now no longer active, but when he was active, he was doing things. So you have people stimulated, kicked into doing political theory, which they would rather not. But slowly and slowly, that's how a new discipline appears in a country. I hope I've
Thank
answered
you.
you.
Yes, indeed, Lord Parekh. Just a bit of follow-up on that. I believe there's this tendency towards a little bit of market orientation of academia in the recent decades. And this is not my own view as such. I believe this was echoed by somebody like Professor Vivek Chibber of NYU, who's talked about the academic professionalization of sorts that's catering to market logic, of the fact that only papers that are reflective of topics from that are in-demand topics and consumer-oriented topics in the popular place are getting selected, or people are writing around on those topics only. So, I just wanted to ask you, how do you look at instances of hyper-nationalism or this sort of a market-oriented academia sort of coming up in a day and age of multiculturalism, especially when it caters to something like political philosophy?
Well, I mean, you have opened up a large range of issues on which I happen to be currently working. You talk about multiculturalism. Now, take India. Anyone who is seriously interested in Indian political philosophy will ask the most basic question, which I haven't seen asked, which is what is peculiar about Indian multiculturalism? What is distinctive about it? How does it differ from Canadian multiculturalism or American or any other? Now, that question has not been asked. Is it the case that in the West or Europe, multiculturalism is immigration generated? Immigrants coming, wanting to live by their own values, and that is creating conflict. In India, it is not immigration generated. There is no immigration in a substantial sense. Where does it come from then? You talk about Muslim rulers, Christian rulers, British rulers, and you see that our multiculturalism has a peculiar historical thrust. You can't understand it without locating it in history, because all your different ethnic and cultural groups are either converts or they are immigrants from abroad or conquerors. Now, once you grasp this, the whole multicultural perspective in India changes. The Hindus and Muslims have interacted and produced what is called a composite culture. And Nehru and Gandhi and others, they all kept saying India has a unique capacity of synthesis. And whenever anything new appears, the old culture that is still there feels challenged, but at the same time, it also goes into the business of weaning out what is valuable, what is not, discards what is dangerous, embraces what is valuable, and takes a new form. And India's multiculturalism is a product of its inherent faculty of synthesis, or what Aurobindo calls capacity for oneness. An Indian mind is always seeking for oneness. I haven't seen this idea developed by anybody anywhere in the world. Right or wrong? I haven't seen it. I've been reading Western multiculturalism all these years. I haven't seen any of them saying composite culture, faculty of synthesis. None of those notions appear. In India, we are sitting on the treasure. We can make an international mark by introducing these concepts and the problems they pose. We don't seem to do that. I mean, several good friends of mine continue to work on this, but they have yet to produce a substantial tome. That's the sort of thing I have in mind.
Lord Parekh, the distinction between, say, the Indian development or synthesis of multiculturalism as well, in comparison to, say, Western understandings of multiculturalism, makes me think of a broader issue regarding, say, Indian philosophy and, say, Indian knowledge systems and Western philosophy on the other hand. Um, I believe that a major strand of thought of leaders like Mahatma Gandhi was an opposition to, say, the supposition that of the Enlightenment of a universalist worldview. So in the Hind Swaraj, Mahatma Gandhi also talks about, before the term became popular, uh, an intellectual decolonization of sorts. And I think scholars like Ashish Nandi and scholars like Vinay Lal, Dr. Vinay Lal I think he teaches at John Hopkins now at UCLA. I think even he has worked on such themes in the writings of Gandhi. Do you believe that, say, philosophical frameworks or knowledge systems in today's day and age, especially as academia in Western universities is no longer confined to, say, native white ethnicities, but you have people of color also entering academia and attaining positions? Do you think that a universalist idea of how such philosophies and frameworks work uh, is still defensible or tenable? Or does such an understanding tend to become Eurocentric by privileging specific ideas which originated in a European context? Because I think that the example of multiculturalism that you gave and the fact that the Indic Ganga Jamuni Tehzeeb, as some of us in North India refer to it as, not being taken up, is a clear example of the fact that there is an asymmetry in the way ideas from the global south are treated. I was interested in your thoughts and reflections on the universality of certain ideas and to what extent is such a universality defensible?
You are right to talk about universality, but in my view, not entirely correct in ignoring the limited ambit of that idea. Think you started with Gandhi, Hind Swaraj. Would you say Hind Swaraj is a pluralist, multicultural tract? I don't see anything multicultural there. Multiculturalism comes in a very Gandhian subtle way, which is to say, Gandhi, when it comes to religion, Gandhi doesn't subscribe to any one particular religion and argues that that religion is the path to God. It has the final truth. That religion is satisfactory for those who believe in it. It has some insights. Other insights you find from other religions. So Gandhi is a Hindu, reads Bhagavad Gita in London and South Africa. Then in South Africa, he also learns about Christianity a great deal. In England, the same thing. Then he learns good deal in India with Islam. So little by little, keeps learning about other religions and becomes what I call a patron saint of Indian multiculturalism. Lots of Hindus, remember Shankaracharya, had started a campaign persuading the British government to declare Gandhi a non-Hindu on the ground that this man was flirting with so many different religions that he couldn't be a Hindu. Aurobindo, in his press conference, when Gandhi had been in Pondicherry, said the same thing. And Gandhi is basically a Christian. It's a Hindu language he uses from time to time, but fundamentally a Christian. Hardly any Hindu or Christian felt confident enough to call this man a Hindu, let alone a multicultural Hindu. So that's the first point I want to make. That Gandhi, in some sense, takes us beyond multiculturalism. The other important thing is that when he talks about different cultures, let wind blow from all directions into my house. My house has windows open that but the doors closed. This idea from Rigveda, Arno Bhadra Kritavo Yanto Vishvataha, may noble thoughts come to us from all directions, which means I am open to all cultures, ready to learn from them. That kind of multiculturalism, in Gandhi's case, is limited to religion. When it comes to culture, is Gandhi prepared to allow urban culture? Why is Hind Swaraj a relentless attack on modernity? He has no sympathy with modern culture. He has sympathy with ancient Indian rural culture. So Gandhi has to be analyzed with great care. And my own view would be that he was a multiculturalist in his own way, on his own terms, in his own context. If you open it up into multiculturalist religiously, culturally, and ethnically, and so on, then Gandhi would not qualify fully. I hope that makes sense.
I have a couple of questions which logically flow from your response to my previous question, and I would like to the first question that I'd like to ask, since you point out that Gandhi's multiculturalism was restricted to religion in some sense. One thing that I felt, and a lot of critics of, say, of the caste system, for instance, also point out that beneath this, say, beneath the composite culture, which has, of course, historically emerged in India over a long period of time, was the fact that one did have an extremely repressive social structure, which to some degree allowed or permitted coexistence. So, for instance, when you have different endogamous jatis, between which no form of social exchanges or communication that sort is permitted, it does allow, say, different cultural practices which are caste specific to continue, to perpetuate over time without, say, undergoing a merger or being blended or being modified to the extent if, say, such forms of social intercourse were permitted. I was interested in knowing your thoughts about, say, the caste system and whether that was, say, a price that India had to pay in order for, say, the preservation of different cultural assemblages and cultural traditions. And also, as a second part of this question, your take on Mahatma Gandhi's views on the caste system and how that sort of played in with, if it did, with his ideas of culture and multiculturalism. So those are sort of the two parts of the question that I had in mind.
Yes, well, I mean, you put your point very well, and I agree with most of what you have just said. In Gandhi's case, I think it will take a long time for me to state my position on this, but simply to say that here was a man who began as a monoculturalist. For him, Hinduism had all the answers to the world's problems. We are the Jagat Gurus. We are going to go out into the world in the shape of Vivekananda, Ramakrishna Paramahamsa, or anybody and spread the message. Increasingly, he began to realize that that was a fantasy. Western science, he began to admire, that there is much to be learned from the scientific spirit of the West. That the West is intensely curious, which we Indians have stopped becoming. So he begins to see value in others, valuable traits in others, and gradually begins to evolve in that direction. So if you look at his ashram bhajanavali, the songs, the hymns that were sung in the ashram, Sabarmati ashram, they have this distinct multicultural thrust. So there will be a verses, surah from Quran, there will be bits from Old Testament. In that level, he remains a multiculturalist. And once you go beyond that and talk about culture in the sense modern versus pre-modern, rural, then I think Gandhi begins to worry me because I don't see much admiration in him for the modern culture. And that culture should go. If I have railways and planes and all those things, well, be careful, I would say. Does
You
that
you point out that in your response that Gandhiji's take or understanding of modernity or aversion to modernity, I should say, uh, worries you to some extent. I, since you would have observed and seen, say, independence and at least the initial aftermath of the independence, and of course India's trajectory since then. Uh, my natural follow-up to your comment or observation on Gandhiji's aversion or understanding of modernity would be, how do you understand modernity or modernization through the lens of political philosophy or political thought? What does modernization mean to you? What does it entail? Because I find that a lot of people end up caricaturizing modernization as a blind imitation of, say, what has been defined or described as modern in the Western contexts, which don't quite always fit into Indian context. And I believe a lot of political thinkers whom I've referred earlier to in this conversation, like Ashish Nandi and Vinay Lal, also sort of continue this Gandhian project of being suspicious of modernization the way, say, Jawaharlal Nehru and his successors and the 1991 liberalization reforms sort of ushered in. So, how do you understand modernity and modernization? Which thinkers do you take recourse to? What are your own thoughts? And how do you think India has navigated these challenges?
the modernity is a big concept. Different writers understood different things by it. Take my good friend Ashish Nandi. When he talks about modernity, he doesn't exclude traveling by planes. On the contrary, he is constantly in the air. Lots of other things that he uses. Modernity has a specific meaning. In Gandhi's case, he's not opposed to machines. He's opposed to machinery or machinism, where machine takes over a human being's function and replaces it. So the first thing to do would be to spend some time disengaging various senses of modernity and ask what modernity he was in favor of, what modernity he was not. The second thing is, just to answer my own question, when he talks about modernity as a disease, as one that has destroyed Western civilization, he is using modernity in the cheap sense of people going for money, consumption, alcohol, nudity, that sort of thing. These are the examples he gives. But when he talks about the spirit of modern science, people reading, remember he asked Pandit Nehru, when the first group of people went to North Pole, and that was the big headline in the Times. Gandhiji asked Panditji, what is this North Pole? Why are they going to North Pole? Why is it significant? So lots of little things that modernity does, he is puzzled by. He can't see the point of it. I'm not sure that he would have seen the point of genetic engineering, and the whole area of molecular biology would not have flourished under the Mahatma. So the simple answer is, let's take him bit by bit, not the whole of Gandhi, for or against. With discrimination, choosing those aspects where he was sympathetic, rejecting those where he was unsympathetic, and constructing a complex relationship between the Mahatma and modernity. Similarly, take classical India. Gandhi was full of praise for classical India, and yet there are aspects of classical India of which he was deeply contemptuous. whether it was untouchability or whether it was caste system in a certain form, not caste system itself. He was favor of it in some way, but caste hierarchy. And like in this way, his whole attitude has to be understood in its own terms. And that also kept changing as the political climate changed. When he knew that India was going to be heading for independence, what do you do with 15% of Dalits? You are going to need their votes. Congress is going to have to cultivate them. So a different kind of politics is played out. So let us also remember that along with his ideological battle with modernity and other things, he was also engaged as a supreme politician of his age. He was engaged in politics. And that requires certain compromises. Perfectly justified.
One tends to focus on certain political leaders and say ideologues or and intellectuals or thinkers as opposed to other ones. While trying to understand the landscape of political thought in any time, for instance, say the colonial time or the post-colonial time, one would say focus on a certain thinker and certain ideologues and certain intellectuals. And one
Yes.
then tends to raise the issue is there is degree of selectivity, is there a degree of relativism in the importance that one accords to a certain thinker and to other thinkers? So how does one engage in this process of reconstructing the political thought of a time?
Well, now that's a very tricky question on which I've been working for the past few weeks, and hopefully I'll be publishing a rejoinder, some of my critics, and pursue the article's basic thesis a little further. I think when you are, Bhattacharya, a professor of philosophy at Shantiniketan, in ideas. That I would strongly recommend as a book for reading. Where the difficulty is simply is, how do you understand the world around you? What do you take to be its problems, which others don't even see as problems? So that you are able to throw a new light on your age, on your contemporaries. Now that kind of newness is what makes Swaraj, where your brains are not simply filled with other people's ideas, but your brains are generating their own ideas in a way that is commensurate with the reality it is trying to understand. I don't know how far I have gone towards answering it, but I hope I have.
I think the other issue that Anshu was also raising in his question was about when one tries to understand, and because we have been discussing modernity and Gandhiji for quite some time, and I think the one understanding which emerges from our conversation is the fact that there are deep nuances to each and every thinker. So Gandhiji was, say, pro certain aspects of classical India, but he was anti certain aspects of classical India. He was not, say, opposed to machines, but he was opposed to consumerist driven use of machinery. I think the second issue that comes to one's mind is one tends to similarly generalize a certain period of time as well, even though there may be, say, multivalent voices, voices of dissent also from a certain period, which he referred to as essentialization. So one tends to essentialize a certain period. So if we were to place, say, Gandhiji in his milieu, how do you view India on the cusp of independence and the sort of challenges that it was facing, and to what extent do you think these have been accurately captured in most narratives of the time?
Well, I mean, here again, the question is, how does Gandhi measure up to the reality of pre-independence or post-independence India? And going a little further even, a question that was asked to me at an audience in Calcutta. A very charming lady said, "Tell me, given Gandhi's limitations in this, that, or the other areas, why should he be called the father of the nation?" Well, I answered in my own way, but there is the question. If you are a father, are you able to represent all the aspirations, all the wishes, all the problems of your children? In his case, none. So much so that I was even told by somebody that if you give Gandhi cabbage, he will grow more cabbage. If you give cabbage to Tagore, he will sell it and grow flowers. That tells you something about the kind of India that attracted Gandhi. Not a romantic India, not the India of Kama Sutra, not the India of the Kalidas and Abhidan Shakuntalam or Bhartrhari's Uttar Ramcharitra. For him, it was the India of Bhagavad Gita and India of Kenopanishad and all that. So it's very truncated view. And therefore it's very striking that after 1948, once he was gone, there was the conference in Baroda. Now that Bapu is gone, what are they going to do? And Panditji was there, and Panditji said, well, we start thinking for ourselves rather than depending on Bapu. And they started thinking independently. Then the result was a completely different program of agenda. So I would simply say, to cut the long story short, that Gandhi grasped some aspects of India, missed out many others, which had to be supplied by his successors, who had the courage to disagree with him. And that's what India is like since 1949. Does that satisfy you?
Most certainly. And I think we can now address the other elephant in the room, multiculturalism. And because I think one of the things that one tends to associate colonialism, or at least British colonialism and the United Kingdom in general, is its particular form of democracy. And I came across a recent declaration by the current Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, which sort of says that settlement in the United, and I'm quoting him verbatim, settlement in the United Kingdom is a privilege that is earned, not a right. And I found a lot of displeasure at his statement from, say, ethnic minorities or people from erstwhile colonies. And the fact that to some degree, there is still this expectation or this desire that erstwhile colonies in countries that were once upon a time colonized should, say, naturally have a right to, say, be a part of the United Kingdom. But leaving all of these specific problems aside, a lot of critics have argued that this reflects a fundamental shift in the way the United Kingdom views, say, people of color or racial minorities, in order to, say, appease a lot of white Britons, as they would say it, who are upset with the extent of immigration. Now, since you have served in the Commission for Racial Equality, but you've also been chairman of the Commission on the Future of Multi-Ethnic Britain, how do you understand, say, the scope of immigration? What should be the scope of immigration in not just in the United Kingdom, of course, in the context of which you have worked, but in the context of democracies in general? To what extent can borders be free? To what extent should citizens come in? And the second part, is integration a word which is often used to describe a duty of immigrants? To what degree is integration? And I think we touched upon this when we talked about multiculturalism in the West versus, say, the composite culture, which naturally developed in the East, sort of juxtaposing the two. To what extent do you think integration can legitimately be a mandatory obligation on part of those who emigrate to the West? And do you think the West in general is sort of falling into a trap wherein they have permitted immigration beyond an extent which the domestic populace is not willing to accept? So how do you reflect upon these issues?
I don't know how many people are interested in integration. I could go on at length, having been chairman of the Commission for Racial Equality. And more importantly, I was chairman of the Commission on the Future of Britain. And after 3 years, we produced a massive report, which was heavily criticized because people didn't like the way we were thinking. But two things. There is an assumption, increasing assumption in the West, that minorities should assimilate and become like the natives. Many minorities object to this, saying, why should we assimilate? We want to retain our differences. So people have invented a new language, integrate. Assimilation is total absorption. Integration means partial adoption of the society's political values, political institutions, and all that. And that's where we stand. And that's what the Prime Minister said yesterday in a highly controversial speech. And he said this country has increasingly become an island of strangers. People don't care for each other, don't recognize each other. They share nothing in common. What do we do about it? Let's integrate. And his predecessor, David Cameron, talked about muscular liberalism should be in the policy. And that can lead to relentless pressure on minorities to integrate. But that's where I should stop on this integration thing, unless somebody wants to raise this question.
I think the second issue then that comes to mind, and I found this phrase interesting, which you cited, an island of strangers, because I think
Mhm. Yes, go on.
Because I think that the follow-up then that would come to my mind is people would associate, say, fraternity, because fraternity is also a concept which has been important since the French Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity. People would associate fraternity with a certain degree of homogeneity in the West, for instance. And when Prime Minister of the UK talked about the United Kingdom increasingly become an island of strangers, it sort of affirmed, at least to my mind, a commitment to fraternity, but also the implicit assumption that fraternity requires a certain degree of homogeneity. So how do you think about the democratic framework, the democratic polity in today's time, day and time? Because I think that the democratic framework can also be used to incite, say, a large section of the electorate against this so-called other.
But democratic framework can work both ways. If it's a dangerous notion to use, because democracy would mean majority, and the majority want the minority to become like it, and you are in trouble. I think this, rather than democracy argument, one would simply talk in terms of, there are various ways in which this issue has been grappled with in the United Kingdom. One is to say guest versus host. You are a guest in this country. We have opened our doors to you. What do you minimally owe to us? Must you always be like Salman Rushdie or Hanif Qureshi and write things critical of us? Must you not feel loyal to us? Now that's kind of genuine cry of the heart when the majority feels that the minority is taking over the country, is not conforming to its norms, its values are changing. In that kind of context, it says, please be like us. And if they are not going to be like us, you have riots and all sorts of things like dinghy boats in which people are coming in the middle of the night, pictures of children drowning. Your heart breaks when you ask yourself, what is the answer? What should you be doing? I don't think the Mahatma would have an answer. If he has, I would love to hear it. And the question is not only worrying the United Kingdom people, the Americans to the same degree, so that our friend Trump has decided to dispatch all these immigrants, arrest them and send them back to Mexico or wherever. So I think what one has to do is to take abstract ideas in a concrete context and understand people's anxiety, but not giving in to people's anxiety, understanding it and finding a way consistent with one's own principles. That has been my struggle. I mean, I sit in the House of Lords. I've been there for 20 years. I face this problem. I'm seen as a spokesman for integration and multi ethnic Britain. And I ask myself, should I be issuing a statement? Should I be taking a stand? What stand should I take? And I think you reach a point where you say, well, look, let things drift. The Prime Minister did the same thing until yesterday when he panicked and he talked about the island of Cage and all that.
Would you say that in as an extension of this line of thought, because I think when I check your list of publications, you also wrote a book on title "A New Politics of Identity: Political Principles for an Interdependent World." And the issue that comes to mind, the follow-up that comes to mind when one reads Prime Minister Starmer's response to this, say, these tensions, which he just, say, some would say vitiated by his statement when he referred to the UK as an island of strangers, is the fact that most of his critics assume that the United Kingdom, as a developed country, as a member of the first world or the global north, has an obligation, because I think you also referred to obligation as well in your response. What do immigrants owe as well? What degree of integration or what degree of assimilation is not assimilation, sorry, integration is an obligation. But critics of, say, an integrationist view would say that the burden is much higher on developed countries or countries of the first world in order to actively grant asylum or, say, the prospects of earning a better living, especially to those countries which were formerly colonized or have suffered as a result of global institutions, that these countries owe a heavy obligation as well. And this takes on the lens of identity and identitarian shifts and identitarian rifts and so on. How do you think of, say, then the obligation of developed countries in this era of globalization? And does it extend to mere aid? Does it entail, say, a more liberal attitude towards granting asylum and citizenship, especially against the backdrop of a falling TFR in most of, say, Western Europe and the developing world? How do you think the composition of these countries will change, especially since, and this has been mentioned in this conversation, the Parekh report was about the future of multi-ethnic Britain as well. So how do you look at, say, the obligations of these developed countries and the expectation that people have from these countries?
Well, these are complicated issues. In some cases, very painful to resolve. In other cases, fairly simple. I mean, if I were to give you one or two examples. In the city of Newcastle, a Hindu who died was to be cremated. His family objected to the fact that he was being cremated in a crematorium. For a Hindu, he must be cremated in the open air, because that's where his body, the elements composing his body, become part of the universal structure. What do you do? And his family wouldn't give in. Cremation must be in the open. Lots of other examples at every simple level. With Muslims, certainly, but our people, Hindus, have not been behind. Now, in that kind of context, every value or every practice that you consider necessary is questioned. What do you do? How do you resolve it? Should a Hindu's body be cremated in the open air or in a closed place? I mean, arguments are on both sides. Then the Hindu comes up with this metaphysical argument that the elements of the Ruta or the elements of the universe must combine with elements of the body and all that kind of. Other people say, no, this is all rubbish. It is old fashioned. Similarly, in terms of marriage, bigamy. Why can't you have two wives? If a wife is allowed to have two husbands, why can't a man have two wives? I don't see any logical reason why you can't. Provided the same right is given to both men and women. So we had a debate on that. But ultimately, I think people who favored bigamy were silenced because they were so embarrassed even to talk about it. So in every multicultural society, at every stage, an Al Qaeda man in London refuses to take oath of loyalty to the king. My loyalty is to the prophet, not to the king. What do you do? A guy goes and says, well, my loyalty is to my people abroad, so I want to go there, fight with them. Gets caught, arrested. After 2 years, when he's released, he comes back to England, and the Prime Minister says, you can't come back because you had left the country as a traitor. So every day, my friend, you have questions after questions. How do you resolve? And it's not just Britain. Canada, even more complicated cases. Should you have the figure of Jesus Christ behind the chair of the president of a court? America, even more. How do you handle this? And I think the wisdom consists in not dismissing this question, seeing them as a challenge to the human intellect. That we have had things so easy. Earlier waves of immigrants were rather docile, fitted in with us, no complaint of any kind. Now they are different. Are we ready for that challenge? That's my point.
Very interesting, because I was reading a bit about conservatism when, in order to better understand some of the challenges that have been raised towards open borders, and in the writings of the late Sir Roger Scruton, he was an eminent conservative philosopher. He coined a term, I think. I've not come across the term in any other writing, oikophilia. And the oikos in Greek civilization was the home. And in Sir Scruton's philosophy, the oikos was a unit of, say, in a metaphysical sense, it was your family, your community, your nation, some would say civilization, Western civilization certainly, as a unit of active, say, as a unit you love, a unit you adore, a unit that you're attached to, a unit that you wish to preserve and perpetuate over time. If not over space, certainly over time. And I think that would motivate a lot of the challenges to, say, current waves of immigration and immigrants, as opposed to, say, the earlier ones, which you, as you say, were more docile and did not face, say, pose some of the challenges which are now being posed. How do you think about this term, oikophilia, and this sort of active love and desire to preserve? And at what point do you think such love becomes bigoted or exclusivist in some sense?
Well, it can take many forms. But let me end this conversation with one poignant example which gave me sleepless nights and which gave the whole country a very disturbing experience. There was a Bangladeshi who was allowed to come into Britain with his family. His family included 2 children. So he arrived at the Heathrow airport, he and his wife and 2 children. The immigration officer asked him, "Are they your children?" He said, "So to speak, yes." The man's suspicion was aroused. "Tell me, please, clearly, are they your children?" He said, "As I said, so to speak." Move out of the queue. Took him to another one room. "Tell us, what's the story?" He said, "The story is very simple. I have a brother. He died. And he said, please make sure that my children are well looked after. Now I'm allowed to bring 2 children. I brought one of my own and one of my brother. He's as good as my child. What's wrong with it?" The immigration officer said, "What is wrong with it? It violates the law of the land." The man said, "But forget the law of the land. It doesn't violate, except the law doesn't say Mr. X should be allowed. Allow this man 2 children. I'm bringing one, my brother's child. And my society, I'll be condemned to death if I didn't bring him. So please." "No, I'm sorry," immigration officer said, "I'll lose my job." Disallowed. Sent back. When the news of his sent back became public, enormous amount of hue and cry. And even now, after 5 years after it happened, we don't know what was the right thing to do. Whether the immigration officer was right to send him back, in fact, punish him for being dishonest, or admire him for being honest. Now, multicultural society poses these problems, which are not always challenges, fascinating. Now, this particular case, if I would do the same thing. If I had a brother who had died in a war or something, and he had left behind 2 children, asking me to look after them, and I was going abroad to improve my own and my son's prospects, and I decided to give one place to my brother's child, what's wrong? I think it's perfectly normal that I should care for others, encourage their spirit of generosity. No. What does the law say? And many people would say, look, if you allow this man to become his own judge and make changes in the law, where will this stop? Tomorrow he might have brought his daughter's, his grandson, and said, no, I had to bring. So the point simply is, these are the challenges of multicultural society. And morally, they stretch your imagination to the outermost limit. I've given you only 2 or 3 examples. I'm faced with, when I was chairman, I was faced with examples all the time. And then you hated that society, multicultural society, because different cultures have different norms. I mean, one incident where an Indian student, one medical college where no Indian was ever admitted. Why? Well, they failed in the interview. How come? Every year you have got about 12 students applying, 4 or 5 Indians, and Indians get rejected. Well, after a lot of inquiry, it transpired that Indians had a habit. In an interview, they will never look at the interviewer straight in the eye, because that means arrogance. What they would do is look at the ceiling, anywhere else, but at the man's face. For the British, this is arrogance. Not to see man's face is evasive, shifty. So all these Indians, given their manners, the interviewer would write shifty, not to be trusted, kept avoiding eye contact. So all Indian students, year after year after year, were not admitted. Finally, after some inquiry, I found out that this was the reason. I called a meeting of all the deans of medical faculties and said this will not be tolerated. And And they all were very sorry. They said, we didn't know this is how they were deciding who to admit, who not. Well, you should be careful. End of the story. But they, to their credit, they said, we'll have all the students back. And they announced that all those who had failed, 5 of them every year for the last 4 years, the medical schools were prepared to readmit them. But they had moved on. So these are the dramas of multicultural society and multicultural human beings. If you look at human habits, oh God, I could take countless stories of people's habits getting caught and say, oh, that's my habit. Oh, I'm sorry, that won't do. And I don't think we appreciate that in human history. For the first time, we are entering a new phase, a phase of multicultural society. There were multicultural earlier, but they were plural societies, not multicultural societies. People were left alone to follow the customs. Full stop. Now, it's not people are left alone. They want to be part of society. They want to vote. They want to take jobs. Therefore, we treat them as equals. Therefore, we expect them to behave in a way which we can share. I can't be in an office working with somebody who shares nothing in common with me. So a plural society is different from a multicultural society, and we are entering that phase for the first time in human history.
That is indeed a profound note on which we are ending our conversation. Thank you so much, Lord Parekh, for your time. We've crossed an hour already, and it's indeed a lot of food for thought in our conversation, especially as many of us in India look forward to, say, pursuing our subsequent studies or higher education in the West and enter into a multicultural pact with, say, the nations that we wish to emigrate to for our higher studies. So this topic is, of course, very personal to several of us, and I'm so grateful that you took out time from your busy schedule to address us. Thank you so much, Lord Parekh, for your time. And we'll be sending you a transcript of our conversation, which we'll be publishing in a booklet of all the conversations and interviews and interactions that we have had this year. We'll send you a booklet, and we'll also send you the video, if you're fine with it, after we have uploaded it on YouTube, after enhancing the audio and editing it. So we'll get in touch with you again shortly for the same. Thank you so much, sir, for your time.
Not at all. It's very kind of you to invite me, and kind of you to listen to me, and to give me a very wonderful diet in terms of questions to ponder over. Thank you.